Hey everyone, you are listening to Ravel, and it's me, as usual, your best buddy Basil. Now, we're not starting the episode quite yet. This is a disclaimer. In fact, it's the second disclaimer that we've recorded for this episode. This episode, as you can probably tell from the title, Infanticide, was originally a podcast regarding the death and the killing of infants in the Bible, which already was a dangerous thing for us to do. And it was something we thought was going to be an edgy and creative, or just maybe some sort of elusive way to talk about things like Roe v Wade, without directly, claiming to have some extra knowledge about the subject. By the way, Chris is here. Hi, Dr. Chris.
Hey, how's it going? I'm just letting you wade into the waters here before
Indeed.
I jump in.
Yes, and indeed we have waters to wade into. Now, that was the original plan for this, and now, we recorded this episode on Tuesday, May 24th, right around what would have been 12 o'clock noon Central Time. And as we all know now, which has gripped the country, there was the horrific event of the Uvalde school shooting. This was happening at the exact moment that we were recording this episode, and indeed we had no idea that this would be the context in which this episode would be sort of destined to release, if indeed we decided to release it.
Yeah.
It was only later in the day, after we had recorded the episode, and I think it was even edited by this point, that the headlines started to really horrify the world about the Uvalde shooting. And Chris, we were put in quite a bit of a pickle, my friend.
Yeah, we were for sure. It was, addressing this topic, like you said, the death of children, kind of touching on it, from the world's perspective, but then really trying to focus on what, what the Bible has to say about it, and especially the hard times in the Bible where you see, God behind the death of children. As you'll kind of hear, you're going to hear the episode. We are going to air it, but it just kind of gave it a whole, different kind of feel after we had recorded it. And yeah, strangely and eerily, and I don't know, maybe providentially, we were recording this episode as those horrific events were taking place. And yeah, we kind of had to take a step back and think, oh, wow, do we put this out in the wake of all of this? And as cheesy as this may sound, or as weird, or, kind of whatever, irrelevant, my wife and I, we have been fans of the show Stranger Things. And just a quick spoiler alert, if you haven't watched just the very first 5 minutes of the first episode of season 4, they ended up, recording this, a year ago or so, and they just aired it this week, just like 3 or 4 days after what happened there. And it opens up with this scene with a bunch of dead and bloody children laying in the hallways of this, kind of schoolroom type laboratory thing. And like even a more kind of vivid picture of, the sorts of things that we're talking about. And I know it might, I don't know, people might, question my reasoning here, but I was sitting there watching Stranger Things, and I was like, this is kind of a secular presentation of, the deaths of children, and we actually are coming at it from a biblical and from a theological angle. And, if Stranger Things can release an episode where they depict and graphically show dead children laying around a few days after, I thought, yeah, it seems a little bit risky, but we're trying to come at it and actually provide biblical and theological answers and perspectives from it. So I kind of thought, it's probably, the Lord's timing. So, yeah, that was what I was
So
thinking.
if Stranger Things can do it, so can we, says Dr. Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you go. And I do want everybody to, well, so again, just to reiterate the disclaimer, this episode, even before the events in Uvalde, required a disclaimer. We do talk a lot about the deaths of children, the deaths and also murder of children, specifically from the sort of biblical context of that event, which does happen quite a bit in the Bible. But, if that's something that you're not able to handle right now or is a little bit too sensitive for you, feel free to skip this episode or save it for later. I do want to just strongly remind everybody that, we do not release this episode sort of flippantly or without lots of prayer and consideration. We have decided to do it after this sort of extended disclaimer. However, just remember that, this podcast is all about having tough conversations in good faith. So if there's something in this episode that really doesn't work for you, and perhaps, again, the timing is just utterly bizarre to us, just have some grace for us and know that it was not sort of released, or it was not recorded knowing the events that were literally happening as we recorded it, and it was not released without really serious, long, and strong consideration and prayer about it.
Yeah.
So there you go. You've listened to it since we recorded it. I have not, but my prayer is that, like all of our episodes, it is an example of having tough conversations in good faith. More than anything, personally, I don't necessarily aim to provide any answers to life's big questions, but I do hope that it inspires thoughtful and honest consideration of the topic matter.
Yeah.
So
it was, as I was listening back to it, it's, we do kind of talk matter-of-factly about it. And again, there's something where, as you were saying, we were kind of in a roundabout way getting at the topic of abortion, though we do end up, you're really talking about, the deaths of children that are actually born in the biblical sense. And there is, a way in which we're talking about it just very matter-of-factly. This is what the Bible says, and here's what we see sometimes happen in the world. But it's so bizarre to think about, the fact that this was going on right at the same time this school shooting was going on, right at the same time we were talking about this. And I couldn't help but wonder, how much more I might have maybe tempered some of my words or something. But it kind of made me just think about that weird ebb and flow that the world is in all the time, where we could talk very sensitively. It's not like this is the first time this has ever happened, and we'll be very sensitive for a couple of weeks or maybe a month. And then kind of before you know it, it's almost like we just sort of become, I don't know, not desensitized, but it's just not at the forefront of our minds anymore. So it's really an interesting kind of like a time capsule in a bizarre sort of way, to kind of see how we deal with all these things. But I will say that at the very end of the episode, and before we knew any of the stuff that happened in Texas was going on, we do take a moment to address the seriousness of the issue. And, again, that was without knowing what was transpiring as we were talking. We talk about the seriousness of the issue and do offer, kind of condolences and things to those who have kind of walked through this in the past. And if you are anyone who has been somehow personally affected by, these tragic events, our hearts do go out to you. And, we have been praying for the families involved, and especially, me as a new dad, and I have 10 nieces and nephews, 11 nieces and nephews, and they're all school age, and just, thinking about it and seeing the pictures and all of the, of the kids. And it's just incredibly horrific. And we, again, as Basil said, this is not something we're entering into lightly here. But it's, it was what we recorded and what we planned to put out. And if we had recorded it live and released it, we'd be kind of sitting there dealing with the same sort of thing. So this is our, kind of honest response, I guess, to what happened there last week.
Yeah. This is right now. Yeah, not this episode. We had no idea what was going on.
Sure.
I mean, it's crazy to think that if we had just, as we do often, if we had just stalled in recording this episode, just maybe even an hour or two, this episode would have probably just not existed, because the news would have started rolling out about what was going on. So I do want to be clear, not claiming any special relevance of this conversation to what happened, but it is the conversation we happen to be having at the exact temporal point when it was happening. And so there we go. I don't know if there's too much more to say, but just so you guys understand the context in which this was recorded, it was almost like a different time. We recorded it before a page turned in history at that moment. So
as the page was being turned.
As the page was being turned.
We were on that thin line right there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's about as much as we can say about that. So without further ado, here is the episode.
The world is complex, the Bible is complex. Human existence is a tangled ball of experience, perception, and understanding. Ravel is a puzzling word, denoting both a tangling and untangling. This podcast attempts to hold honest conversations in good faith. Some ideas expressed in this podcast will be challenging. Others will be obvious. When a PhD in biblical interpretation and a habitually podcasting man-child discuss matters of society, scripture, and scandal, you get Ravel.
Hey everybody, you are listening to Ravel, and it's me, your best buddy Basil. And with me, as always, we have the loving father, the defender of the born and unborn, and the Dr. Baby himself, Dr. Christopher Ryan Gates. What's up, buddy?
That was good.
Yeah,
like
bringing it back.
That together, yes.
Bringing it back.
I just was thinking the other day, I don't remember what was going on, but I called myself the baby doctor over here, and I was probably in some dealing with my son or something like that. People say that we look alike, he and I, so it might have had something to do with that. No, what it was I was talking to a friend. I think I called my son the king of babies because that's my nickname for him. He is the king of all babies, and they called him a doctor baby, and then I said, no, I'm the baby doctor. That was what happened. Anyway, this is way beside the point.
That's some Ravel deep cuts for you, folks.
Yes.
Well, what an interesting time we're going to have today, Chris. Welcome everyone to the Infanticide episode of Ravel. You heard us correctly. It's two different words, infant aside. We thought we'd take a moment to talk about babies. Now, it does occur to me, Chris, we talk about babies fairly often on this podcast.
Recently, yes.
Recently, yeah. But we thought we would take a whole aside to talk about babies, since there's lots of things happening in the world that relate to, infants and various sizes and forms of those infants. And it got us talking, I mean, I'll just say it. We all know what we're talking about here. There's the Roe V Wade situation, the ongoing controversy, which is so much more complicated. It is complicated by the fact that there is no actual official opinion or decision by the Supreme Court. It's that, it was leaked by whoever to do the whatever, and just happens to be, something to set the whole political landscape on fire just in time for the midterms. But
sounds specifically like a conversation for another podcast.
That is specifically not what we are talking about on this podcast. Instead, we are going to take an aside, an infant aside. And here's the thing, folks. We like to think we're pretty edgy around here. Is that not true, Chris?
We like to toe the line for sure.
To toe the line of edginess? What line are we towing?
Yeah, of, controversy. It's there,
Walk the line.
Scandal.
Walk the line.
Society, scripture, and scandal.
That's right. Scandal being one of the trinity of things that we talk about on this podcast.
Yeah.
We do like to walk the line, see how edgy we can be without actually, putting ourselves in physical danger. We talk to heretics. We talk about, the Teen Study Bible from Zondervan. All sorts of things.
Yeah, I don't know actually if I have mentioned on the show yet or not, and you might tell me if this is the first time you've heard it or not. But in Greek, the word for stumbling block that you hear, every once in a while is actually scandalon, and it is from where we get the word scandal, and it is something. To cause a person to stumble.
Yeah, okay. That is way better than what I thought you were going to say. You were asking if I knew what the word for scandal... No, what was it? Yeah, scandal, right? No,
yeah.
Stumbling block.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say it was going to have something to do with babies.
Oh, no.
What is the word for stumbling block in Greece? In Greek?
Yeah.
Oh, man. My brain's fried already.
So like scandalon, right? And it's interesting because when we talk about kind of scandal, on this show as part of the tagline, I mean, it's, when we were discussing that little tagline, when society and scripture kind of collide, then you naturally have this scandal, this kind of stumbling block sort of thing. And this, issue, as we have kind of been talking about it in a veiled form here of infanticide. If nobody's done the math on that yet, I will clue you in.
Very clever. Very clever.
Yeah.
Very funny. We're talented young men.
You did a nice job with that one.
Yeah, thank you.
But it is a scandalous sort of issue. It causes kind of a stumbling for folks as they are considering how they ought to think about it. And it definitely trips people up in a lot of ways. So we thought, it would be worth broaching in some way, shape, or form here.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll say it again, we're not explicitly here to talk about Roe v. Wade.
No.
Honestly, talking about that sounds incredibly boring, and I'm not sure if I have personally anything, nothing I could say would add any value to anyone else's perspective on the topic. But instead, in place of that, it did start a conversation about infanticide, and specifically infanticide in the Bible, because I'll just say it, there is, a contingent of perhaps biblioskeptics or secularists or, atheists or whatever, that love to bring up the fact that, babies be dying all the time in the Bible.
Yeah.
And for several different reasons. I mean, there's a whole sort of buffet of context around the death of infants, tiny human larva humans.
Oh my goodness.
What's the right? No, okay. Too edgy. Backing off a little bit. Sorry. Here we go. Walking it back.
Oh my goodness.
In the Bible. And of course, the sort of standard political and religious stance on the Roe v. Wade situation is known and, not necessarily up for debate too much within the church. But, if you're really trying to look at the biblical precedents for the different reasons, methods, I don't know, I'll just say reasons and methods. Any other taxonomy you want to put on there for the infanticide in the Bible?
Justification would be something of a reason,
Sure.
I suppose.
Yeah,
But
I guess that's another word for reason. Yeah, we could bust out the thesaurus and make it different, use different words. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do it. We're going to try to not sort of be edgy just for edgy's sake. I think that there's something worth discussing in here, because if for no other reason, it is important for us to understand what is in the scriptures. And, I don't know. Honestly, folks, can I be honest for once on this show?
Please.
For once, I'll finally do it. I'll take off my mask. It is... Chris, I'm not going to lie. I 100% forgot what I was about to say.
Oh, well, that's what happens when you try to be honest, see?
That's what I have. Yeah. Am I incapable?
You're so used to your
no.
native language of lies.
What were we talking about? We were talking about here's what I was going to be honest about, which also relates to me completely forgetting, which is we're not exactly sure how this is going to go.
No,
we have
not at all.
We've done I would say an adequate amount of research, but we saved a lot of the discussion for the show. So we hope that you come on this journey with us. Again, we're trying to have tough discussions, tough conversations in good faith, and so just know that, we're trying to do our best here, and give us a little bit of grace if we don't end up doing our best. All we can do is try again. Yeah. All right, Chris. So would you like to start us off? I think the best way to start perhaps is to just dive right into a piece of scripture or intelligentsia, like Christian writing. What do you think? What's the best way to start this? My mouse ran out of batteries, so while you tell me this, I'm going to plug in my mouse.
Nice. Yeah, well, I guess the question is, as you were talking about, as, kind of, at least in the last, probably my whole lifetime here, getting close to 40 years, the issue of abortion, which we're not talking about specifically, again, but it has brought up the issue of the sanctity of life, as we like to talk about, and the preservation of innocence, and that usually having to do with, unborn children. But then, sometimes even past that, getting on to, young, early childhood years there, the preservation of that life. And of course, while that's not really particularly, at least not yet, in a lot of instances, something that we're too concerned about, we seem to all agree that when a person is here in the world, outside of the womb, we all kind of have a unanimous decision, that this person is of value and their life matters and that sort of thing, and they're protected under the Constitution and state laws and all those different things. However, as the conversation comes up about the protection of innocent life, and as Christians start to make that argument, people who want to push back against the Christian argument, the biblical argument for the value and sanctity of human life, and particularly that of babies, like to point to instances in the Bible where you have essentially God sanctioning the execution of men, women, and children, and giving divine command for the nation of Israel to go in and utterly destroy, some foreign nations, and even specifically pointing out and telling them that they need to leave no one alive, not even any of the children.
Yeah, we have like very specific instances where Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is giving commands to kill, well, everything, often including livestock and all humans, but sometimes like even just explicitly saying, kill the babies, which is, to be clear, should be, and if it is not, this is a question we all need to ask ourselves. It should be an honest moment of pause and reflection, I believe. Not that there is not a way to explore the context and the, I don't know, of course, most of the baby killing happened in the Old Testament, things like that. But if we are not honestly approaching this topic of the Lord ordering the killing of babies, then I just don't think we're being very intellectually honest with ourselves.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you kind of, brought up, I think, the subject matter a little more broadly, and then you kind of specifically said, why don't we talk about babies dying in the Bible? And I was like, whoa, that's okay. I mean, I guess that makes sense. That's kind of what we're trying to do here. So, but as I started thinking about it, I was like, it's not something that I have spent a lot of time on. And this actually, so my particular, area of study is biblical studies, and that's dealing with the text. And when you move over more into the realm of systematic theology, they're going to have, entire seminars that are based on, about morality or even apologetics, where something like this is going to come up, and they're going to kind of wrangle with these a little more closely and intimately. In biblical studies, we're basically just kind of looking at what does the text of Scripture say, and not necessarily always all of the implications. That's usually the task of the systematic theologian or the apologist in some cases. So it is something that I have certainly considered, but maybe not to the fullest depths that some apologists may have, because this is an area that it seems like needs defending, and it's there, like, kind of all over the place. So you really can't get around it as you start, thinking about it, and as you brought it up, and I'm like, okay, so let me start researching babies, dying in the Bible. I mean, it's like, basically, if you want to lay the responsibility at God's feet, you don't have to get far into the Bible. I mean, until you realize in Genesis, God floods the entire world, and he kills every single person in the world in a flood, in that there certainly were, who knows how many babies, that died in the flood. And you have that very first instance there of God just kind of taking all human life altogether. Then it's not too long after that, in Genesis 18, you have that account where Abraham is there, and he's, camped outside of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot is in there, and God says, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah has reached to heaven, and it's time now for judgment. And you have that really interesting dialogue that happens between Abraham and God. And, Abraham says, will you spare the city? Surely you won't kill, the righteous with the wicked. Will you spare the city if there's 50 righteous people? And God says, yeah. And then he says, well, 45, and then, yeah, and then 40, and then on, and all the way down he goes, until basically it gets to the point where Abraham can't make a defense anymore for Sodom and Gomorrah. And then, God comes in and he rains down fire and brimstone and destroys the cities, and certainly have to, assume that there were children there too. So, we're not even out of the first couple major portions of Genesis, and we already have God killing children and babies and women and, all kinds of different things. And then you're going to move into the history of the nation of Israel after they go into captivity in Egypt and they're delivered and they're, in this time of conquest when they're going to take the promised land. And you have all of these instances where God is sending them. In Deuteronomy 20, he says he's sending them to take, to basically claim the land, what will be the land of Israel. And he says, however, in the cities and the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So he says to kill everything in Deuteronomy. Then you have passages like Judges 21:10, and it says, so the assembly, this group that was put together of Israelite warriors, sent 12,000 fighting men with instruction to go to Jabesh Gilead and to put to the sword those living there, including women and children, it says specifically. And then you can move into like 1 Samuel 15, and you have this account with Saul, and Saul's supposed to go in when he's fighting against the Amalekites, and he's supposed to completely destroy everything. And then 1 Samuel 15, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people in Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So we're not very far into the narrative of the Bible, and you already can find several instances where you have God either by his own hand through fire or water killing thousands, tens of thousands, millions maybe of children, and then also commanding his people to go and to essentially do the same and to put them to death by the sword. So it is a fair question for critics of the Bible to ask of believers, and it also is a fair question for believers, as you were saying, to really think deeply and thoughtfully about this. What is going on with all of this? What's going on?
Yeah, it strikes me in these instances, a few of these instances that you mentioned, that let's say the orders, the sort of military situations where the Lord orders Israel to go into somewhere and, fight the battle and kill everybody, and then very specifically mentioning, including the women and the children. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that it's like, it seems like there's some sort of exception being made there. Was it not sort of the idea in those ancient times that when you did go to war, you mainly killed the men of fighting age, and then you would just take everybody else as slaves, more or less?
Yeah, that is
slaves and wives and
slaves
whatever.
And wives and concubine. That actually is we're teaching through at my church right now. We're going through John, and we were just in John chapter 4 and Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in Samaria, and we spent some time going over the historical background of the Samaritans and whether or not people know the Samaritans were initially Jews. I mean, in some regard, people may still consider them of Jewish descent. They came from the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, and they were Jews. But after Assyria came in and conquered the northern kingdom, the king sent these men into the area of Samaria, and they basically killed all the men, and then they took for themselves wives, these women from Samaria, almost certainly against their will. So yes, it started to intermarry with them, and this is why there was such bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans, because the Samaritans had been, their bloodline had been tainted. Therefore, there's no promise of Messiah coming from them. But yes, as a practice, it was kill all the guys. and then keep the women,
that was kind of the general rule of warfare, that, women and children were kind of considered spoils of war, almost.
Yes, of the war, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
There's a lot less people back then. A human being was a bit of an asset, and yes, it was part of the spoils of war. So, just to explore the full context of these more sort of military moments when the Lord is saying, especially in 1 Samuel, where it's, put to death the men, the women, the children, the infants, and the cattle, and the sheep, and the camels, and the monkeys. Just kidding, donkeys. There's a part of it that is like, you will take no spoils. Like, these will not be the spoils of war for you. 'Cause especially cattle and sheep and camels and donkeys, basically being financial assets of the time. And also children and infants, I guess, literally would also be considered financial assets at the time.
I mean, you turn the kids into slaves and the wives into your, little the women into your objects.
Slaves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in the context of 1 Samuel 15 and a lot of these other military instances, there's like something going on, like something else going on, where it's, you're doing this because I'm telling you to. You're not doing this to gain spoils of war. And it just so happens that I'm going to give you explicit instructions to kill all the babies. And it is very strange for me to be in a position right now to be trying to parse out these sort of implications, the moral specific implications of killing babies, based on sort of what is the way, like, it's you're not doing this. You're not going to kill the babies because, we want this mission or this war to be more righteous. That's like this is a righteous call from God to defeat your enemies, and you're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it for the money here, so you got to destroy all the assets, all the loot that you'll get, and that just happens to include children. Again, just extremely brutal. And however, I could see if you were an ancient reader of this text, you'd be like, "Oh yes, wow, what a righteous act to eschew all the financial spoils that you would receive from defeating your enemies, which just so happens to be killing babies." This is difficult for me to articulate. Am I making sense here?
Yeah, I think it is an important kind of element in every time that you have conquest of any other, foreign nation by, the people of God, you have basically God telling them, don't take any of the spoils. And whether that be their animals, whether that be people as slaves, whether that be, the financial resources that they have, like you see with Achan, the famous story of the sin of Achan, where he takes, gold, silver from the enemy, brings it back into his tent, and he hides it there. And then, of course, God judges him and his entire family because of that. And the point that God is basically trying to make there is your provision is not going to come from any of these pagan places. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you everything you need, and then some. And we're not collecting our resources from these people who are condemned to death. It's just not going to happen. So you leave it there. It's this basically demonstration of the people's faith. The same thing with the wandering in the wilderness with the manna, that it's like, I will provide for you. I will meet all your needs. We're getting these people out of the way so that I can give you this land, but you don't need the things they've acquired. I'm going to give you your own blessings. So yes, very much the point that you were making is there is a great theological point about God to be made there. There's also just kind of the social aspect of it, like you were talking about. But it's not simply just an issue of it being, whatever, a dependence on God or not taking these resources for yourself. When you go back to that passage in Deuteronomy, he's talking about basically utterly destroying all of these people. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 18, he says, otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So there is also this sense of purity that God is trying to preserve for his people. And the whole, I mean, it goes all the way into the New Testament that a little yeast leavens the whole bread, right? So just a little bit of these, false pagan practices coming into the camp have the potential to turn the people, basically against God in the end. And as he's trying to preserve them, purity is extremely important. And what you actually end up finding out, and in this passage in 1 Samuel 15, when God tells Saul to go in there and to kill everything and everyone, Saul doesn't do it. And then you have this continued sort of difficulty with the Amalekites all throughout the history of Israel, where they never completely get rid of them, and they're always fighting against them, and they're always having this conflict. The Israelites are then being killed by the Amalekites. They're being taught, the ways of these other nations, and up into, and we're getting to, the fact that the Israelites themselves will begin offering their own children in worship to these other gods. So yes, there's a sense, I think, of dependency in God and a certain virtuousness, if you want to, and righteousness in the conquest, that we don't need the things that your nation has. But then there's also another side of that coin that is preserving the purity, in the camp of the Lord. So both of those, I think, are kind of important there, and might be part of the motivation. Now, is it moral is the next question.
The moral thing, we'll hold on. We'll hold off just a little bit, because I just will say that on its faith, both of those, on its faith, that's a nice Freudian slip, on its face, rather, both of those reasons still feel a little bit troublesome to the, on the surface level of the topic. Economics and purity being reasons to exterminate infants is, we're gonna need to dig into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so so far in pretty much all of these examples, there is either the context of economics, purity, reliance on the Lord, things like that, all wrapped up in the infanticide. Now, to go back to the explicit instruction to eliminate infants in these cases, it does seem like I guess I might just be repeating myself, but it seems like an exception. This is an exception. This is a special case where you're being told to go the extra mile in your battle here, and do something you normally wouldn't. The alternative being, taking the infants as property. I suppose that there would be some sort of conversation to be had about, from the perspective of the infant, what would be better, to be exterminated or to be made a slave for the rest of your life. But I'm not sure that would be a very profitable conversation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I do, and they get kind of more to the moralistic aspect and kind of maybe the justification, if we are trying to offer one to and for the Lord in what's going on. But yeah, I think that there is something to be said about the outcome of surviving, such an episode for those children. So, I mean, I can jump headlong into it. It might take us away from where we're going. But
that's what I mean. I'm just wondering if it's profitable or not. I think maybe just having that hang there as a consideration is just enough to get us through it. You did use an interesting term there, justification, which is still troublesome to me, Chris. Justification for exterminating the infants. But that's just what we have to deal with, I think. Terms like that being put, because, especially in modern times, the whole conversation is about justification, on one side of the, of the culture war. it really gets into this sort of granular conversation of like, well, when is it okay to exterminate babies? What's the justification? And it's like, oh man, sometimes I just think like, are we really having this conversation? This is just we are really dealing with it here. Okay, so we have let's keep moving forward. I think I've mentioned, I'm kind of making a list here of all the different, concepts that are wrapped up in the biblical extermination of infants, which is why I kept kind of repeating like economics and purity and things like that, because I think that those same things still kind of get wrapped up in it today. We may not use the terms, but there's certainly an economic aspect to even the modern day conversation.
Oh yeah, I think that's heavily discussed,
which is
anymore,
still
honestly.
troublesome.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about Psalm 137.
Yeah.
Would everybody like to turn in their Bibles to Psalm 137 as we examine this poem or this song in the Psalms? And I'm going to just read the entire chapter all the way up through verse 9. It's so, because I think maybe for a moment, let's try to get the whole context. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Okay. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks.
Yeah.
So we have here a song or a poem, just again sort of lamenting lamenting the fall of Jerusalem, and how, if we forget Jerusalem, may we not, sing songs, may we not even remember how to play the harp, and we must, it's all about remembering Jerusalem, and specifically remembering it in sort of a joyous manner. But then going to remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, again lamenting the fall of Jerusalem. And then referring to daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. So on the list of troublesome concepts attached to infanticide in the Bible is, happiness. Happiness is the word that's used. Happy to dash the babies against the rocks.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts right off the bat here?
I do. So, very interestingly, so you have when you're talking specifically about the word happy, there are different ways to understand that, and it is pretty well in the Bible, both in the Old Testament when it shows up and in the New Testament, interchangeable with blessed. And this is actually where we get our Beatitudes from, right? Most famously in the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus says, blessed is, are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And that word blessed, if you've ever done a study through the Beatitudes, it can also equally be called happiness. And happiness has to do with basically your circumstances and being content in your circumstances.
Right.
And basically, it's not a joy. It's not like it's not a thing that springs up from way down inside of you that, overwhelms you with this kind of joyful giddiness or something like that. Happiness has more to do with a contentment with
in this situation.
Right.
I would love, we should do an episode on happiness, because especially sort of the Greek construction of the concept of happiness. I mean, it's kind of right in the word, which is it was a happening of
right.
It was an event.
Circumstantial, yes.
Yeah, happiness was an event, and in the sort of Greek culture, it was specifically an event that the gods were involved in. And so if the gods were involved in an event, then in a happening, then you were happy about that.
Yeah.
Which is so fascinating to me compared to what we kind of consider happiness to be, or, where it's just like, we're all sort of told, mostly by the advertising industry, that like happiness is supposed to be our standard default feeling. Like, you ask people, are you happy? And most of the time they say yes, even if they're not. And it's just like, yes, I am living in a constant state of happiness, and this is how normal people are supposed to live. And so let's all get a Coca-Cola and feel the happy. When in, the more traditional use and understanding of the word, it was like an act of the divine to feel a moment of happiness, which I think a lot of people could sort of benefit from understanding happiness that way.
Yeah.
Anyways, I digress.
Well, as it pertains to, happy or, happy will, the Israelites be when their enemies' children are dashed against the rocks, it draws to mind a certain amount of kind of righteous vindication for those who have been tormented and oppressed by their enemies for so long. And it comes back to an idea of, basically from the Levitical law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And that law basically was given not as, a means of retribution, but it was given as a means of restraint, basically. And what the Lord was saying is, if someone does this to you, then the appropriate repayment is the same thing back. And it is demonstrating the heart of God, which is fair and equitable. It is that the punishment fits the crime. And that's the law that's to be understood from an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, when you come into, the realm of the Babylonians coming in, destroying the nation of Israel, raping and pillaging and slaughtering their infant children, then you look at it through that lens, and what's going on is you have a happiness, a contentedness with the right judgment of God, the equitable judgment of God that is coming now on the enemies of God. And these Israelites who watched their own children be cast off of the cliffs and be, dashed against the rocks in order to be killed, now that is being repaid. And there is, as much as everybody wants to move past something like that, some kind of retribution, there is a sense in every single one of us that demands justice when there is injustice. You see it in the world all around us, and we all have areas where we're going to cling to that, and there is something about the nature and character of God inside of us that craves justice, that we want for justice to take place. Now, on this other side of the cross that we are now living in, all justice and all retribution was met in the cross, in the person of Jesus, and we can hang now on knowing that the Lord has dealt with all sin, once and for all at the cross, and whether we have our sins absolved there, or whether a person makes a decision to reckon their own sins with God when they should meet him face to face, it's all been dealt with. So we rest in that now, and we now are a people who are not going around and, seeking vengeance against our enemies, but we're offering forgiveness. And this is the heart and the nature and the character of God, but on display in the Old Testament is this sort of foreshadowing, or not necessarily a foreshadowing, but it's an outworking of what the law actually is. These are the things, these are the eternal realities that are taking place here on the earth to demonstrate to you the full outcome of all of this. And I think that, I don't know, maybe this is kind of the best place to throw it in here, but it really is, when you're thinking about, the innocence of children, and kind of, the what seems like a travesty of having some kind of child, whoever they are, from whatever nation they are, killed, then you really start to have to ask yourself, why is that a tragedy? Why does that not sit well in my stomach? What is it that why do I have a difficulty? And when you start to get to that question of why, that's where we're going to start to kind of find the answer of what's going on here. So why is it that people think that it's so terrible for children and infants to be killed? I'm not saying that it's not, but why is it so terrible? Well,
why is it so terrible? Well, I think that this sort of I would say the immediate sort of agreed upon modern issue, I think, if we were to sort of axiomatically pinpoint some simple explanation, is that it's a loss of potential, I think. And that could take any form. That could take many forms. It could be, the potential for that child to live a life and make something of themselves and feel happiness and just generally have a chance to experience creation. I mean, when I boil it down, that seems like something everybody can agree on, whether or not you prescribe to the sort of secular science of the birth and when is potential, viable. I mean, that's even in the modern conversation. There's they call it more like viability. Is it viable? But I think potential is kind of the one thing that we can all agree on that is unfortunate. Is like the potential is gone. And you can look at that. You can kind of look at that in a lot of the similar contexts that I've been putting on my list here. I mean, if you are an economist or, a government official, the more babies, the more sort of economic potential your state has, your nation has, or whatever. Purity, I don't know. Potential, yeah, okay, I don't know. Just keep more humans, I guess. Happiness, the potential for happiness, not just of the child, but of course, what kind of happiness could they bring to the world, to their parents or whatever. So I'm going to say potential.
Yeah. Well, and I think that actually is a very reasonable and satisfactory answer. And then, I guess you would have to ask the question, who would have the best idea of a person's potential, or who would have a perfect understanding and infinite knowledge of a person's potential. And then, of course, we would have to say that would be
all together now. Come on, kids. It's Jesus.
Yes. So it is God who has complete knowledge of, every person's life, where that will go. In Psalm, 139, which I feel like we just cited in, the previous episode. I have it pulled up right here, Psalm 139, I think it's verse 15. He says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." And then you have passages like in Jeremiah 1, and it says, he's talking about Jeremiah, and he says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So we know and understand that God has a perfect knowledge of each one of our lives, all the days of our lives, before we're even formed, right? So it's infinite. It goes back into eternity past. He knows us. He doesn't just start to know us when we're conceived, but he knows us forever and always, and he knows us entirely. So then, if you bring it to the case of when God would, let's say, sanction the death of an infant, then we have to assume that God knows what would potentially have been the trajectory of this person's life in an infinite number of variables. And this getting into that idea of kind of Molinism, basically the idea that it's basically a multiverse sort of thing. And God saw the infinite multiverse, kind of like Doctor Strange there in Endgame or whichever one it was. And he sees all the different scenarios and then actuates only this one, right? Like this is the best possible scenario. And that's kind of an idea of Molinism. Anyway, we can say that whether or not God does that, he has the potential to at least see all of those different things. So in seeing all of those, we trust that he is making the right and the just decision for every person in what ultimately really is going to be the best thing for them, even for those people who rebel. So then you come to the idea of what is the destiny of a child who dies? And then are there different destinies, or are they all covered under grace? Is there an age, quote unquote, of accountability? It's very difficult. Some people will argue for an actual age. I think it's kind of ridiculous. There's not a specific calendar day after a child is born where they become accountable, but there is a period in time, I believe, a moment in a child's life when they start to become accountable to God. And I think that before that, I tend to believe that all children in their innocence are covered under God's grace. And we've talked about this before on the show, but for parents and things out there, when a child starts to become ashamed of their nakedness is usually a time to start talking to kids about sin and about forgiveness, because that is the symptom of the recognition of sin, as we even talked about on the last episode, that when Adam and Eve sinned, they saw their nakedness and they were ashamed. The same thing with children. When they start to realize there's something shameful about me and I need to cover my body, then that is the time that they, I believe, start becoming accountable to the Lord. And before that, I believe that they're all covered by God's grace. So there is a way to think about it in which you either have these kids going on to live, the Lord lets them live, he sees, the way that their lives might go, and the fact of the matter is that they're either going to grow up and they're going to reject God, and then they're going to be damned to hell if they die, or they're going to grow up, perhaps come into covenant with God somehow or another, and then be brought up to him, basically with him in heaven, or they're gonna die where they are as infants, and they're going to be covered basically by the wonderful grace of God. And there is an argument to make that it is something of a gracious act of God that he would take these children out of the world before they have the opportunity to be corrupted and to turn to false gods. So it is an angle, I'm not saying it's the right one, but it is an angle in understanding this, that it's actually a very gracious thing of the Lord to do. And that's hard to wrap your mind around, that it would be gracious, because like you were saying, there's this elimination of the potential, but we have to rest in the fact that if the potential were going to be something like he talks about with Jeremiah, where I appointed you to be a prophet to the nations, then if that potential was going to come into existence, then God wouldn't extinguish that life. So we have to kind of rest in the fact that the potential for probably all of these Canaanite and Amalekite children was probably not a great one.
Yeah. Well, again, it seems like no matter how you look at this, Jim, there are troublesome aspects to it. But, I think it's interesting. That's an interesting concept to explore. And again, we say a lot of things on here, folks. We're just exploring ideas here. I don't think you are saying that. Well, are you? Maybe you are. Are you, do you think that is, well, let me phrase it another way. The idea that there is some sort of mercy whether that be sort of eternal or even just avoiding the horrors of this fallen world or whatever. There's some sort of positive spin that you can put on the extermination of an infant, is also sort of a snarky, intellectualistish, I guess, rebuke on these stories of the God of the Bible by someone, like an atheist or something, or somebody trying to convince you that, God is bad or whatever, the Bible is bad. They would say, oh, well, see, if there is an age of accountability, why don't we just kill all babies before they reach that? Wouldn't that be the good thing to do? And it's, kind of one of these elementary little traps that they try to set for you. Yeah. But it is interesting hearing it from you. Like, well, following that logic, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And the distinction, of course, to be made there is when somebody brings up that argument, and even, talking about abortion, which we're not specifically talking about, but in a roundabout way we are talking about. And I have heard people make the argument, well, if all, children are innocent and their lives are so precious and they're covered under, the grace of God, then what's so wrong about abortion? Because all these kids are going to heaven, and they might be born and grow up and reject God and end up going to hell, and, want to use that as a justification for, taking of, a innocent human life. And of course that just, it is not up to us to decide life and death. It's 1 Samuel 2, verse 6. It says, the Lord brings death and gives life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. That it is God's to decide when a person dies. It is God's to decide when a person comes into the world. And there are times when he uses human agents to extinguish the life of another at his divine command.
Yeah.
So
I will say, if I may, that theologically, academically, that makes a lot of sense. However, if there is the issue of, we can read in the Bible, and then God said this, and this person heard it clearly and did the thing. But, you hear on the news nowadays, oh, mother kills children because God told her to. Yeah. Oh, that's a kind of a difficult one to deal with there, Christopher.
Yeah, well, you can't really say for sure what God has told anyone to do and not to do. I mean, we try to line up all of those things. Any word of prophecy, we would say, which is a woman saying, God told me to kill my kids. We would say, well, that's a word of prophecy. If it's true, we're going to test that against Scripture and make sure that it measures up. So I would say there's plenty of reasons in Scripture, again, on this side of the cross, to look and to say, doesn't seem like something that the Lord would command a person to do. However, I am not the Lord, and it's difficult to say. The Lord's never told me to kill any children. Right. But she'll have to answer to the Lord for that one day. And that's going to be between her and him.
And also she will need to answer to the law. And, just because if indeed the Lord told her to do this, which we are playing with some truly absurd hypotheticals here.
Sure.
But if that is the case, doesn't necessarily, that's not a defense. Yeah. It's not a defense as far as our realm. If there's some sort of higher divine perspective that this needed to happen, the mother is still on this earthly realm and should be dealt with accordingly, which, depending on what state you're in, could transfer her into an unearthly realm pretty quickly. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, that you bring up the law, because there is a distinction, too, to be made between killing and murder. And I've heard people too, when this discussion comes up, say, well, God prohibits murder, but then he's telling people to either go and murder these people or kill these people or whatever. And there is a real distinction to be made there, because murder is the killing of someone either out of anger or malice, or specifically by like a dictionary definition of it, murder is killing someone when it is not in accordance with the law. And there are, even in our, in our own modern and civilized world, legal ways, in which to kill people.
Right.
Some people might say that would be abortion. And if you don't want to go there, then we would say something like capital punishment. And capital punishment is not murder, but
Right.
it is killing someone. And we would say that all of these instances in the Old Testament where God commands, for all of these people to be killed, that is a form of capital punishment. That is not...
Yeah. Or it's war. In war, you don't say, our soldiers
murder
the enemy.
Well, just depending on
And
who's
also,
reporting the story.
Well, right. Yeah, I guess. Depending on what side of the culture war you're on. But also, situations like self-defense or this or that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there just is in the semantics, and we always try to define our terms around here. So that is one to just differentiate between murder and killing. Killing is not always wrong, even by our modern legal standards. Killing is not always wrong. Murder always is wrong in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law.
By definition, because
Yes.
it is wrong killing is sort of an easy way to think about it.
Yeah.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Now, part of the conversation that comes up in modern times is old Mr. Molech. Old Mr. Molech in the Bible there. This is a different... So we've talked about sort of the wartime instructions that can include... killing babies, murdering babies, whatever, exterminating infants. But there is also old Mr. Molech, and old Mr. Molech keeps getting brought up even in more contemporary examples of what people might sort of perceive going on today. Let's see here. Do we have this pulled up here? Oh, well... Molech shows up in a few places, but one of them being Leviticus 18. Well, let me just start out and we'll make it there. So this is Leviticus 18. Now, Leviticus, of course, has all sorts of instructions, but here's one section that also includes instructions. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. And then kind of goes on a list of instructions. And, as is the sort of Levitical trope, some of the instructions seem obvious, and some have a bit more of a sort of absurd nature, looking at them with our modern eyes, but I'll just read through some of them. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Okay, seems legit. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Okay, I'm sensing a theme. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. And it kind of goes on like that for a while, at least 5, 6, 7 more verses of who not to have sexual relations with. And then we get down to verse 21 that says, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. And then it continues on with, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. So a whole lot of sexual instructions, and right smack dab in the middle of them is do not sacrifice your babies to Molech. What's going on here, Dr. Christopher?
Well, I have not, to be perfectly honest with you, considered the exact context of this, prohibition being couched in the center of all of this sexual misconduct. But I would say that there is something about the sacrifice of children to Moloch which is tied to sexual activity, and it has a lot to do with fertility and those sorts of things. Not that Moloch was necessarily a god of fertility, but there is the offering of children to this god in order for blessing. And then, of course, children are the byproduct of sexual relations. But there is, mostly when you started that passage out, the key distinction that God is making there is not practicing the ways of these nations around you. And that also, something that we see taking place, that was in Deuteronomy 20. That was why he said to wipe out everybody, so that they don't infect you with their practices and their ways. This is what he's telling them. So you do have these weird sexual practices in all of these nations, these very devious and perverted nations, the Canaanites being among some of the worst people, and the Canaanites being the ones who introduced the worship of Molech to the Israelites. And in that worship of Molech, some of you listeners may have seen, depictions of those statues, and they would basically construct these statues out of some kind of bronze, and a metal, would light a fire in the base of the statue, and then would either have it having these extended hands out, or would have an open belly, and they would place their children basically in this oven that they had created, where their children would be cooked alive as an offering to Moloch. And that being one of the practices of those people, along with all of the different sexual deviance that's taking place there. And this is the thing that God is saying, you should not do these things. This is not something that I have commanded, not something I have instructed. You read that out of Leviticus, and we have also the passage from, as my computer slowly pulls up our show notes, from, where was the other one? Jeremiah 19. They have built high places to Baal, on which to burn their children in the fire as offerings to Baal, something I have never commanded or mentioned, nor did it enter my mind. So God is continually dealing with the nation of Israel in the matter of child sacrifice, and this being a practice that they picked up from the Canaanites, from the Amalekites, from the Phoenicians, from all of these people who were in these surrounding lands that were practicing all of these things, and God saying, you should not be doing these things. So what's very interesting is that you have God kind of eradicating these false and horrible and detestable practices in wiping out entire civilizations, even including the children, so that these things don't persist. And when the nation of Israel does not follow God's instructions, as they did not do in some of these commands to eliminate all of these people, these sorts of things persist, and you actually see a continuation of it. So it is, if we're talking the words justification again, if you want, then it is, the taking of these perhaps infant lives here at this one point in history in order to spare the taking of all of these other infant lives in a way that is dishonoring to God, because it is turning people's hearts away from God towards these, false idols. And we were talking a little bit before the show about this passage in Jeremiah, that, God is saying that they're offering their kids as sacrifices. This is something that never even crossed my mind. And I brought up the fact that as I have read this, I thought, well, what about Abraham and Isaac? Like, you asked Abraham there to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Child sacrifice, like, at some point entered your mind. And I have, read about this and studied about it and prayed about it. And the distinguishing factor there is, of course, that it's the direction that the offering or the sacrifice is going. That in these instances with Baal and with Moloch, essentially, there are powers and principalities behind these, entities, and they basically all are drawing their power, their evil, their influence from Satan. So it's Satan worship. I mean, they're basically worshiping Satan under a different name. I mean, Baal is where they get the name Beelzebub, which is another name for Satan. So you basically have these people worshiping Satan in sacrificing their children. And what the Lord is saying is, I don't want you. It's not about killing the babies primarily, even though that might not sit well with people. It's about where is your worship being directed. And the Lord says it's for everyone's good. If everyone directs their attention and their affections towards me, it's going to work out for everybody's good. And that's kind of what is going on here. Again, why it's couched right in the middle of a bunch of sex talk. I'm going to have to look into that. I didn't know you were going to spring that one on me.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not the scholar here, but I thought it was interesting as it's couched in like a lot of sexual prohibitions, most of which seem fairly reasonable. It almost seemed like it was being referred to as not quite a type of abortion necessarily, because the children are born, obviously, but if a child is born in the context of one of these prohibitions being broken, it seems like perhaps it would be an easy way out for an Israelite to I don't know, take the unwanted child over to the old Molech furnace and just solve the problem there, which you could see God coming in and saying like, wait, no, hold on, that's not the solution to the problem here. Because most of these are sort of incest related, which, as we know now, and I'm sure they were aware of at the time, was not necessarily the best outcome when it comes to procreation, most of the time. And so I don't know. That just occurred to me. I'm not a scholar or any sort of credentialed person.
They're just saying here that it is just a list of abominations. That it just is one of many abominations. So they're just.
I don't know, man. There seems to be a theme through the chapter.
Yeah, well,
this
have
literally
weird
the
sex.
only one. This is literally the only one that does not refer to sexual contact with another
I'm going to keep on
person
looking at it. I'll see if we can get an answer before the end of the show or the next one. But go ahead.
We'll see. Oh, well, I don't know. There's not much to go on there. But this is, and of course, in the modern conversations about abortion, Molech is sort of regularly referred to. In fact, on the Wikipedia page for Molech, they list the different, in popular culture section for they have it as Moloch, which is a different transliteration, is what Chris told me.
Yes.
One of the in popular culture references, no, I take that back. It's in the as social or political allegory parts of it. It says this is a funny one. This is not the one I was going to say, but this is funny. During the growth of vehicle ownership in the United States, the concern for automobile deaths prompted at least one editorial cartoonist to label the automobile the modern Moloch, viewing the car as a machine of death. So That's fun. Yeah, but there's also a rhetorical connection between abortion and the child sacrifice to Moloch has been drawn by anti-abortion movements since the late 19th century. So obviously that is part of the modern conversation as well. And that's why I thought it was interesting that the verse about or the command about Moloch was sort of couched in Leviticus in a list of other sort of sexually related prohibitions. So anyways, I am not a scholar. I'm just reading the words, man. So I'm not sure where to go from there. I mean, just to review, we have the Lord commanding the extermination of infants by the Israelites in times of war, perhaps as this may have been merciful to the children who would have been taken as slaves. It also probably had an aspect of cultural and perhaps racial purity that would have been sustained through that practice. We've got the a sort of eschewing of economic gain that would have resulted from keeping the infant alive, which again has sort of a troublesome virtuousness to it, depending on how you look at it. And of course, the justification being, God said so, and God has some reasons here. And then we take a look at what was the other version we looked at here? Well, of course, we have the Levitical, the sacrifice thing. What was the other one? We had one other topic that we explored. Oh, we read the psalmist, where, this was, somebody was taking happiness in sort of revenge baby killing, which is again another troublesome. No, I should stop saying that, because I should just have a blanket statement. Anytime these children are being murdered or killed, there are troublesome aspects to that. If you take anything from this episode of Ravel, Basil thinks exterminating infants is troublesome, no matter how you approach the subject. And then, of course, we just went through the Molech issue, which is the kind of very specific sacrifice of children. Are there any other sort of taxonomies by which the extermination of infants shows up in the Bible?
You have obviously the Exodus account, where
and also
course,
King Herod.
Yes,
Herod killing the firstborn to sort of maintain power, try to get rid of the Messiah.
Well, and that was the same reason Pharaoh did it too, was to maintain power. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've got sort of this elite power grasping feel to it, which I'll just say it again, troublesome, Christopher.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what's interesting in the Exodus account is that you have all the babies being killed, because Pharaoh's afraid that the Israelites are going to become too numerous and overthrow them, and has them all executed. And of course, it is Moses who's spared in the midst of that by the hand of God, the protection of God, and through the acts of his family, raised there in the palace, and then goes out into the wilderness after killing an Egyptian, and comes back and then delivers his people through these plagues that God brings on Egypt. The 10th of those plagues being God revisiting again an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth upon the nation of Egypt, and of course gave them numerous occasions to repent. And we don't know which of the Egyptians may have actually followed the Lord's command to, take the blood of a spotless lamb and to cover their doorposts. But they had the opportunity to avoid this judgment. But God revisited judgment on the nation of Egypt in kind that they had basically dispensed against the Israelites. So it is another one of those instances where you kind of have to think about, like, is this right? Is it fair? Is it something that's appropriate for God to do? And it brings up kind of that moral sort of issue, which is something too that people are going to talk about all the time. They want to make moral arguments against God, and they will say it's immoral for God to kill innocent human beings or whatever, and they want to make a moral argument basically to invalidate any kind of belief in God. And William Lane Craig does a really good, he's got a little kind of 3-step process here where he goes through these moral arguments against God. Anytime someone wants to make a moral argument against God, he contends that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. And that's a very long conversation that I could not do justice to in trying to explain, but I think most people understand that morality, if you believe in some kind of naturalistic, cause for life and process of life naturalistically, there's actually no reason for morality. Morality, it would actually seem to be detrimental to us in a certain regard. Some people are going to talk about a herd mentality and those sorts of things, and they can make sorts of arguments for it. But really, C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity it's one of the better arguments that I've ever heard really spelled out before, because he just does it in such a practical manner. If you've never read Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis makes a great moral argument for God. And he basically just says there's a right and a wrong and everybody knows it. Ravi Zacharias used to say, if there's a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. And we all understand there's right and wrong. So William Lane Craig starts there. If there is right and wrong, then there has to be someone who encoded right and wrong. And that is somebody who's above and beyond us, and it's God. And you can call it whatever God you want to. As Christians, we're going to call it Yahweh, Jesus. That's going to be our God. You can call it whatever God you want to, but you have to admit that there's something else beyond ourselves that's instructing us as to what is right and wrong. So if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, and objective moral values do exist. So then, therefore, God must exist. And of course, Ravi takes it the other way, and he says if there is no moral law, there's no moral lawgiver, and he just kind of has the reverse of that same argument where, William Lane Craig argues it to the positive and Ravi Zacharias to the negative. But the fact of the matter is that if you're going to hinge your claim on morality, then you have to basically agree that there is a God, at which point you have to say he's above and beyond us, and who are you, oh man, to question what the Lord does. So you can take all of that, and is it right, is it moral, for God to do all of these things? And we have to say, if there is a God, which we believe that there is, then yes, everything that he does is right. Everything that he does is moral. And while we may not understand it, that doesn't mean it's wrong. And you really shouldn't spend a lot of time arguing about it. Maybe trying to understand it if it's something that you really just struggle with and you can't sleep at night because you can't imagine God commanding the nation of Israel to go in and, plunge a sword through the torso of a 1-year-old, which is difficult for me to fathom, especially as I, consider my own newborn son. It's kind of hard to fathom, but it doesn't keep me up at night. If it does keep you up at night, you got to pray. You got to pray and ask for the heart of the Lord on that. I mean, that's really going to be something that only comes through revelation. As I was preparing for this, and as I was reading through all of these different brilliant guys and scholars who have commentated on all of this and who have apologists who've offered, I went to article after article after article, and almost across the board, unanimously, all of them said at the end of it, God is sovereign. He's above all of us. We can't understand everything that he does. We never will, but we have to rely on and trust the fact that he is the author of life, and he is also the one who takes life, and he is the one who judges. And we rest in the fact that we know that all of Scripture testifies to that sort of thing. And then we just have to say, I don't maybe understand it and I don't get it, but I still trust God. I mean, and you can say the same thing about hell. I mean, really. And the question is it any more of a tragedy really for, a child to perish than it is for a full-grown adult? I mean, you talk about, the potential of that life and that being actualized in the world and all of those different things. And yeah, I suppose there's perhaps a perspective there, but really, if human life is human life and if it all has intrinsic value, it's really, it's kind of a little more sad to our hearts, and maybe our hearts feel a little more tender towards babies, but it's not really any different than an 80-year-old man. I mean, really, the tragedy is the same, that if it is a life that has not come into fellowship with God and they depart from this earth, they're going to be in a place of, eternal torment and judgment for their lives rather than experiencing the fellowship of God. So it's really, for me, I mean, it's kind of interesting that we would choose for this to be, such a horrible issue in contrast to anybody else dying.
Well, it's interesting because there's a couple different aspects of that. Because when you think about, and you can apply this, I think, now across history, because there, as always, there's a difference in perception from the individual level and from the collective level. And that is one of the, I would just say, one of the many complicated and troubling parts of having this type of exploration or conversation, which is on an individual level, either the natural passing or the extermination of an infant will have or can have an entirely different impact or yeah, well, I don't know. It's just entirely different versus collective. Like you read in the Bible about, the Israelites being commanded to, exterminate men, women, and children and infants, or you hear about the flood, which certainly there were millions of infants involved in or taken out in that situation. And when you're talking about these big numbers, that's an interesting thing. But then you bring it down to the level of, say, one little baby in a basket floating down the river, and bringing it to the individual level. It's almost like quantum physics in a way, where in our human-sized world, physics do one thing, but then when you zoom in as close as we are able to do, the physics are entirely different. And I kind of feel that way, again, without any sort of big point to make, but I feel like that same thing kind of applies when exploring this topic. When you're out in the sort of bigger view of things, that is when you're able to say, like, yes, well, who knows? I mean, God has a reason, or is able to see the perspectives, and it's just what needed to happen. But then you zoom in to an individual level and say you imagine one Canaanite woman in a hut huddling with her baby as, the Israelites, the enemy Israelites, are ransacking her village. And, you zoom into this moment, this story, and you imagine being there or being her as an Israelite, some stranger, some seemingly filled with bloodlust because their God told them to come kill you and your baby. That is an entirely different set of physics for me to sort of invoke or imagine. I am, and I hope the rest of you listeners are, thoroughly troubled by the conversation, thoroughly unstabilized, because I don't think that there is, I don't know if we considered this at the beginning of this episode or when we were planning it or whatever, but as is our fashion, Dr. Chris, I feel like we have fixed nothing and clarified nothing, but have taken an hour and a half to explore troublesome ideas that we get to sort of just let float around in our lives for a while until the next episode.
Oh man, I always have some hope that we're gonna clear something up or do something, and then you always, with my little precious hope, dash it against the rocks and feel so happy about it.
Happily, yes, I will happily dash that little moment of hope, Chris. When you spent years of your life finding answers and being taught to arrive at satisfactory conclusions, and I am here to trouble you from start to finish.
I actually have a friend who I just had lunch
No
with.
way.
I do, one.
You have a brag.
Yeah. Who I just had lunch with, and he is finishing up his dissertation. He's been at it for a while, and he is writing his dissertation on Jephthah from the Book of Judges, who, if you know, is the one who made the promise to God that he would offer as a sacrifice, the first thing that he saw coming into his estate, coming back home, if God gave him victory, in this battle, and God gives him victory. And then, of course, Jephthah comes home from battle, and the first thing he sees is his own daughter. And then it kind of cryptically there, and Judges talks about the fact that, and then he went and offered his daughter, as a sacrifice. He basically made good on the covenant that he made to God. And that's a whole big old messy can of worms that we're not going to get into right now. But I was just thinking it might be interesting if we wanted to kind of follow this discussion up. We could have him come on, and he's somebody who has spent a lot of time. I spent about an afternoon researching this specifically, but he's spent a lot of time, years, kind of looking into and around that. And very interestingly, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah before he made that covenant with the Lord. And then, of course, so it's almost inspired by God that he makes this promise to God. And then when he comes home, well, there's standing his daughter. So people are going to argue about whether or not sacrificing his daughter meant that he actually killed her as an offering to God, or if it meant that he, committed her to temple service for the rest of her life. And there's a discussion to be had there. But nonetheless, he kind of deals a little bit with that idea of child killing in the Bible. Yeah. So it might be interesting to revisit at some point, and maybe he can bring some more clarity to the issue for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, here's my clarity, and this seems to be a running theme, which is I think that certainty is something that is so easy for us to claim, whether it's regarding ancient scriptures or modern controversies. And I, for some reason, have this obsession with groping around in the dark through some sort of labyrinth, specifically with the intent to eradicate any certainty that I have on any one subject.
Yeah.
And I think that I am succeeding very well in that mission.
Yes, you are.
And that I wouldn't call it a mission. I'll call it an impulse, some sort of sick impulse that I have to do these sorts of things. And when we are going through our lives, sometimes certainty is a healthy thing to have. And I think oftentimes we see that it is not so healthy. And which times are which, I am uncertain. But I hope that it at least introduces an interesting hour and a half of conversation for people to listen to, think about, and scoff at my attempts to dash your hope upon the rocks.
At the very least.
At the very least. Well, I think we're drawing to a conclusion here, Chris. What do you think? Do you have anything else that needs to be said or explored?
No, I mean that plumbs the depths of my understanding of the death of babies in the Bible. But I do want to close on we have talked a little bit kind of loosely about this, just to mention the fact that it is, a very sensitive, subject for some people. And if you are a listener who has made it this far in the shows, we've been talking, wouldn't say casually, but perhaps, a little cavalierly about this issue. And you are someone who has, suffered through the loss of a child. I was just speaking with a lady at the church here this past week who has lost 3 children. Don't know the full circumstances of all of that yet, but I will find out soon. We're going to get together. But I know that it is something, that a lot of people struggle with. So I do, just want to say that, being a new dad, it's not something that I take lightly whatsoever. And if you're somebody out there who is, trying to not reason with why would God, command the slaughter of children in these particular regards, but why would God allow for my child to die, in an untimely manner? The only advice that I can give you is that God loves you. You're in the palm of his hand. He is looking out for you. He is causing all things to work together for your good, and just to continue to keep on pressing in. And in the same way that, as Basil said, there's lots of areas where we feel like we're just groping around in the dark. It's sometimes in those instances that you bump into the arm of the Lord. So just want to encourage anybody, because, I think we might have forgot that this can be, a pretty touchy subject for a lot of people. So blessings to any of you out there, and I will leave it at that.
Indeed. And I think I will leave it at that as well. You know all the pitches, folks. Yeah, don't feel like you need to leave a rating and a review based on how this episode made you feel. But if you have any questions or things that you'd like us to discuss further, whether about this topic or another topic, you can send those questions or comments over to contact@ravelpodcast.com. And as always, you can just tune in to the next episode and let this one float away down the river. Chris, do you have anything else to say to the nice people out there?
Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to Ravel. To learn more about who we are, what we believe, or how to support this ministry, visit our website at ravelpodcast.com. If you have a question you would like answered on the show, or to let us know how we're doing, email us at contact@ravelpodcast.com. This project is made possible by the prayers and generosity of listeners just like you.
Righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned.